innovated. Kind of one of those guys that's a little bit bashful on the side, but he has become a very good friend. And I'd like you to introduce John Underhill.
All right, so we'll talk about stabilizing. I was honored when Mark said that you guys wanted me to come and talk about it. It's something I do, but you know, I had a guy tell me, "Oh, I didn't know you were an expert at that stuff." I don't consider myself an expert at anything. I just have a lot of time on my hands, and so I get to play around with it. For me, I do a lot of resin casting, so it kind of goes hand in hand. Stabilizing and resin casting works well together. For me, the way to think about that is, if you're turning something and your wood is soft, if you're going to turn something and your wood is a little softer than the resin, if you've turned a lot of resin, you know it can be quite challenging. It's harder. So by stabilizing the wood, it gives you a little easier consistency when you're working your tool. I always think of it like this: if I get a little aggressive,
it's got a weird sound to it.
Like
you guys, it's got a weird sound to it, right?
maybe it's
Yeah,
is that better?
You don't want the next 3.5 hours to be.
Okay. Is that better? A little better? Okay. If you get aggressive with your tool and you start to cut into the wood, as this is turning, obviously you're going to hit the resin parts. If you have two different densities in that material, then you risk blowing the resin out and digging in a little deeper into the wood, and then you hit that hard spot, it's going to be prone for blowouts or chips. So by stabilizing that gives you the opportunity to kind of equalize the density in that material. Makes it a little easier also for finishing. I see a lot of people online, they talk about stabilizing, mostly casting. One thing to remember is stabilizing, what it does is it replaces the moisture or the air in the wood fibers with resin, right? It doesn't fill gaps. It doesn't really strengthen if you've got a live edge and you want to stabilize that. It's not going to keep the bark on the wood. You're still going to have to go over with some thin CA. It may help make it harder, but it's not an adhesive. So where it all began, a lot of guys used to use this Minwax wood hardener. There was a couple different versions. This was one of them. They would dump this in a bucket. They'd put their wood in there, weight it down, and then they would actually put it in a pressure pot, and they would increase the pressure, thinking that was going to force this stuff in there. You might, this is really thin stuff, you know, as thin as water. It would soak in, but if you've got a larger block, it's going to take a long time to get that chemical in the center of that block. And then, now you've got to wait for it to dry. I use this stuff. I didn't really care for it. It was for smaller pen blanks and things like that. It might work all right. It's great when the siding on the house dry rots. You don't want to replace the board, dump it on there and paint it. I wouldn't be stabilizing with it anymore because there's better things on the market. Another thing they used to do is take acetone and plexiglass, and they would melt that into a slurry, into a container, and then they would also soak their wood pieces in that. But again, getting that inside of a wood pour, especially if you're dealing with something like this. This was an olive root, and it had some. Okay, this was an olive root. Can you hear me any better? Yeah. Okay. All right. So the olive root had cracks in it. Any better in the back? Can you still hear it through the speaker? You can hear it? Okay. Just talk. Yeah. Talk, 1, 2, 3, test. Can you, oh, there you go, I can hear it now. Okay. So, no, thank you. So in order to get that juice in the center of this stuff, what you're gonna need to do is vacuum. All right, so what we do is we take basically a juice that you buy on the street. I get mine, kind of, yeah. I bought this on the street from you, didn't I? So you can get this from a couple different vendors out there. I always use Exotic Blanks because they carry Stick Fast, BVV, Cactus Juice. They've got all the brands out there. They're all good. I'm not concerned about if I use a little bit of this one and now I need to add to it. I'll cross-contaminate from brand to brand, and I've never had an issue with it. You can get it catalyzed or you can get it uncatalyzed. What that means basically is if you buy this stuff already catalyzed, within a year, you're probably going to have to throw it away if you don't use it. If you buy it uncatalyzed, basically you're going to get a jar like this. It's going to have kind of a crystallized little paste in there. All you're going to do is take the cap off, pour a little bit of the juice in there, shake it up, and then pour it into your resin. Shake it for a bit, maybe let it sit for a couple hours, and that'll break down. So now that it's catalyzed, it'll actually cure under heat. Without being catalyzed, you can buy that and let it sit for a couple of years and you'd be just fine. Just keep it in a cool area. You're not going to want to set it in direct sunlight or in a hot closet or anything like that. So we'll get into why do we want to stabilize? I hear a lot of people that are into casting saying, well, we need to stabilize all of our pine cones before we pour resin on it, or we need to stabilize sweet gum pods. It really all depends on what your chore is, right? What's the task you want to achieve with that? The way I explain it is, if I'm going to turn the heart of that pine cone down, then yeah, I'm probably going to want to stabilize it. Now, I've turned these down without it, and I mostly sand them to shape. Soak them real well with CA as you do it, and they'll hold up. So stabilizing isn't always a necessity. But if you're going to pour resin over it, resin's going to get in between all of this stuff here. You're going to put it under pressure. It's going to be sandwiched in between resin. I'm not going to be too concerned about stabilizing a pine cone if I'm going to submerge it in resin, because the resin's going to hold everything in place. And then as I turn that down, I can take thin CA and saturate it. Regardless of what I'm turning, if it's a sugar pine from out west and I'm going to make a bowl out of it, it doesn't matter how big it is. Just every now and then stop and saturate the fibers with some thin CA. If I were going to do Banksia pod, now if I'm going to just drill it out and cast it in the holes, I'm going to get to the heart of that, which is really hard, so I really don't need to stabilize that. But I'll pass these around, and as I pass stuff around, there's a blue Rubbermaid tote in the back of the room. You guys can just throw everything in it so nobody has to run it around. But the outside of this surface is pretty fuzzy and soft if you've ever messed with them. So what I want to do is I want to match that side up with resin. So as I turn it, these corners get turned away, and what you're seeing is everything left. So I can't have that soft and fuzzy because my resin's not going to stick to it very well, and I'm going to have a lot of air pockets. So by stabilizing it first, we harden it, and then we're able to cast it or do what we want with it. So obviously another issue is the main goal of stabilizing is to take something soft or punky and be able to use it again. A piece of spalted maple, which is extremely light and dry, we're able to soak it in the resin, and then as you see this, it's hard. It's usable wood again. We can also color it. They sell a lot of dyes on the market, and basically there's two different dyes that they say you can use. I always thought alcohol would be okay, the alcohol dyes. They say kind of stray against that. Unless you're going to use the powdery stuff, you can break down in this. So by dyeing it, we can have a little bit of fun with it. I'll be honest with you, I'm not a big advocate of adding dye to my juice. And the reason is because then I can only use that juice when I want to turn something this color, right? Wouldn't it just be easier to turn this down and then rub some food coloring or mix up your own dyes and alcohol and put a clear finish over it? So that's where I opt to do it. But I'll pass these around just so you can kind of feel the weight difference in them. This last piece here was a cross-cut piece of maple, and it's all crusted on the outside. This is how your wood is going to come out of the oven. As you cook this stuff, the resin's going to expand as it hardens, and you're going to get kind of a crust on the outside. Hit it with a belt sander. It cleans up, and I've got an example of that with it. You guys can look at these and kind of see. The problem with the dyes also, look out. Thank you. Another problem with the dyes is you never know the color combination. This was supposed to be red, and it looks kind of pinkish. So the wood's going to have an effect on it, what kind of wood you're using, how soft it is, and how well that color breaks down in the juice. Red is always the worst color to work with. It doesn't matter if it's resin, if it's dyes. You know, if you guys have experimented with that, you know red is extremely hard to get a good red. The best part about cactus juice or So they call this cactus juice. It doesn't matter if it's BVV or whatever. It's just kind of got a generic name, kind of like Kleenex, right? It's brand name, but everybody just defaults. So cactus juice is the stabilizing resin that a lot of people use. Another thing it allows you to do is you can take something just all rotted out like this little piece of Buckeye or box elder burl, and you're able to stabilize it. So now it's hard, and then what you can do is add some color to it with resin, submerge it in the resin, and cast it. I think that was pretty much the intent behind stabilizing when it first came out, is to be able to take unusable stuff and make it usable. And then it's just kind of bled over into everybody's experimentations and playing around. But again, the problem is it's not a filler. The misconception, we deal with so many resins. It's kind of like epoxy. You know, we've got epoxy adhesives. Now we've got epoxy resins. We've got thin set. We've got deep pour. The stabilizing resins are just that. They're just, you're replacing the air in the wood fibers with a resin. So it's not going to fill cracks. It's not going to add any adhesive. It's just going to make it harder. Then casting resin is what we'd use to fill cracks. Now, an advantage to stabilizing is if you're casting that wood and you're using dye, you're able to stabilize the wood first, so that way when your resin, your casting resin, has dye in it, it doesn't absorb into your wood. So your wood keeps the same color, and you keep the color in the resin and not in the wood. All right, any questions yet? Nothing? Cool. So, one of the first things I think everybody started stabilizing was corn cobs. And this was one I did a long time ago. It had a nail hole on the bottom because the squirrel ate the corn off of it on a tree. What I recommend if you're going to do this kind of stuff, sometimes it helps to drill a hole through the center of it, maybe a 7 millimeter. That way, no matter what you're going to turn out of it, if it's a pen anyhow, you're probably going to be larger than that, or that itself. So by drilling a hole in it, it allows another way for that resin to get inside the pores of that object. This is an example of not stabilizing the wood before you mix the dyes in the resin, and you can see how the wood actually absorbed the color instead of staying in the resin. Just for the heck of it, I'll pass this around as well. Anybody mess with Buckeye burl? I love Buckeye burl, but if you've had it for a little bit, it starts to really get dry. Buckeye and box elder are the two woods that I find that I stabilize the most. Buckeye, if I filled this container with Buckeye burl, I guarantee you I need more than a gallon of resin for that because it absorbs so much. It's just so porous. But I'll pass these around. One is stabilized and one isn't, so you can get an idea of the difference in densities. So when we decide we're going to stabilize something, the first thing we have to do is clean it. Usually with wood, it's those live edge burl that people want to stabilize. They want to take a piece of burl, they want to cut it, to keep that live edge, and then they want to basically cast some resin over it. So now you've got resin, kind of a hybrid blank. You've got the resin and all the points and whatnot of the live edge. I'll pass these around together. But you have to make sure that the burl's clean. Because what happens is if you cast it without the burl being clean, as you turn it, all that stuff is just a weak spot for it to break away. So as we get these pieces of burl and we're going to stabilize them, if it's loose, you're going to spend probably an hour or two picking at this stuff. A few of my favorite tools of choice. I like the dental picks from Harbor Freight because they're a lot sturdier and stronger than actual dental tools that you buy online. They don't bend as easily. Some extra fine needle nose pliers. A putty knife is great. A little screwdriver. Anything you can use to get in all these crevices and pop this stuff away. I don't want to make too much of a mess, but you're going to have to clean all this off in order to get to the wood. You want to remove all the contaminants. Another reason is you don't want all that floating off in your resin And then as you're turning it down, you've got all this beautiful color and then a big glob of bark hanging in there. So I always start out picking at it first, and then I have to dry it. Now, you may not get all of that off as you want. Another fun tool is the brass wire brushes and the drill press, and give them a good spin and just let them work at it. I know some guys, when they get the green wood, they'll hit them with the pressure washer, try to knock all that stuff off. It really all depends just on the condition of it. I'll pass it around just so you guys can kind of see what we're trying to achieve as we pick that bark off. But what happens is, a lot of times, if it doesn't all come off, it's because the wood's still too wet. So we have to dry the wood, and then we have to clean it again. I will say stabilizing is one of those things that it's not like, hey, I'm gonna go turn a bowl, or I'm gonna go turn a pen. Stabilizing starts on a Monday and it ends on a Friday. It's the longest thing you'll ever do. The nice thing about it is, it's like watching paint dry, you know? You get it started, and you walk away from it, and you do other stuff, and then you just keep checking on it. What I do is, I dry the wood. Now, the easiest way to dry the wood is in an oven, and I do that when my wife's working. And she loves when I use her oven. So this year, I went out and I bought a smoker oven, and it's just one of these at Menards. It's electric, because I didn't want to have the gas when I'm working with resin, because I don't want to have that issue of a fire. I will say, I was talking to Ed Brown before I came here tonight, and Ed's done a lot of demos on stabilizing, and Ed does a lot of stabilizing. The first thing he said was, make sure you tell him, don't let the stabilizing juice get on the heating elements in the oven. I think Ed almost lost an entire shed, and I know he lost a smoker to a fire that they say the stuff isn't flammable until you add a heat source. So this is what I bought, and it's just a Pit Boss. It stands about that tall, and I was going to make Dick carry it in with his truck, but we already had it full of this other stuff, so we left it at home. But it's real simple after you spend 3 hours putting it together. I buy the foil pans, and the wood sits right inside the pans. It's real simple to do, but basically, it's a designated oven. So now I have this on my patio with a little grill cover on. It looks like I'm going to smoke some dinner, and instead the neighbors get to smell resin curing. Nobody's coming to my house to eat. So the problem with the toaster oven is they're so close to the coils that two problems. One is I don't want the heat source, the coils, that close to my resin, because it does expand, it does boil out a little bit of the wood. And two, it's hard to regulate a heat. So as you pick your oven, make sure you get one of these. So they'll help you be consistent, because temperature is really the key when you're doing this stuff. If it's not hot enough, it's not going to cure properly. If it's too hot, you're going to cook all the resin out of the wood, and you're going to be back to square one. You're just not going to get the product you want. So I think this cost me $7 at the local Walmart. So we'll get to that. The key number is 225, and that's heating, warming the wood, and for cooking the resin. They say this resin has to cure. It only takes 10 minutes for this resin to actually solidify at 194 degrees. The problem is, if I've got these two pieces, and now I've got to get core temperature. So I've got to get the resin in the center of this to 194 degrees for 10 minutes. It's going to take longer than 10 minutes for me to do that. So one thing they say is, once you start the heating process, if you stop and try to restart it, you're going to have a failure. It's not going to work. You can cook it all day long if you want. And for an example, I cooked this for 5 hours, because I wasn't sure how long to leave it in, because I don't usually do larger stuff. So these two both went in the oven, and I left them in there for 5 hours at 225 degrees. No problem. You can cook them 12 hours if you want. You're never going to overcook them as long as you don't exceed a temperature. Again, they say 194 degrees. 225 is basically in a safe zone. I'll pass these around as well so you can see. This block started out at 203 grams when it was dry, and by the time I soaked it for 3 days and cooked it, it's now 395 grams. So it almost doubled in weight. But, I mean, feels like a rock. You know, I'm not gonna turn it. It'll be a great demo piece to show how heavy this stuff gets.
Recommendation for you? If you want to get one of those ovens, wait until about August, September.
Oh, yeah.
Look on
after the grilling
Facebook
season.
Marketplace.
Yeah.
I found over 50 of them for 20 to 50 bucks.
Well,
They look new.
yeah. Yeah, I like the smoker. I'll pass these around too, just so you guys can see. The top corner, I had a little bit of oil leak out of my pump, so you'll want to avoid the top corner. But you can see in the picture, I mean, there's nothing to it, right? It's just it's an electric oven. Got an outside outlet, I plug it in and lock the lid and let it cook. So I always make sure that the temperature is right there at 225. If it creeps up a little bit or it drops a little bit, I'm still good because I only want to hit 194 anyhow. So if I were to go 250 or higher, what's going to happen is that resin is going to boil out of that wood as it hardens, and you're going to lose the stability that you're trying to gain.
John, when you dry the wood first, is it the same temperature?
Yep. So water boils at 218 degrees. As long as you're above 218, you're going to evaporate the moisture in the wood. 212? Okay. Okay. So when I started out, I used to always set it about 218 to 220. It's just, if I'm going to do 225 to cook the resin, it's 225 to warm the wood. You know, you just don't want to burn the wood. You just want to warm it. So you warm your wood, you put it in there. Here's how I would do that. I'm going to take a postal scale. I'm going to turn it on, and I'm going to set it to grams. So I'm going to weigh this wood, and I'm going to just take a pencil. I like to use pencil because I can sand it off really easy. If I use a marker or I use ink, I have to worry about the ink staining the wood. So it's just easier to either, if I'm only working with one piece, write it on a piece of paper, but I usually have an oven rack full, so I'll just write it on this piece of wood, and I'll weigh it up. .208. So I'm going to write 208 on here, and I'm going to put it in the oven. Every hour, I'm going to take this piece of wood out, and I'm going to weigh it in grams to see the weight drop. So after an hour, I pull it out and say it's 195. I'm going to put it right 195 on it, put it back in for an hour. Each hour, I'm going to check that until I get the same reading. So say at hour 6, it comes out and it says 195 degrees, it was the same as hour 5, then I know I have zero moisture in this wood and it's dry. So now I have two options. I can either stabilize it today, or I can bag it up, put it in a Ziploc airtight baggie, and wait a couple days before get to it 3 days later. That's going to absorb moisture. So I'm going to have to start all over with the drying process. Now if I put it in the baggie, I would probably dry it again for a couple of hours just for the heck of it. But before you just drop it in the tank, you want it to kind of cool the room temperature, because if you don't, what happens is, now I bring my wood out and it's 200 degrees, this stuff sets up at 194, and I pour it in there, now I've got a mess in the tank. It's going to start curing in my tank. So now that my wood is dry, and I've decided, all right, I'm going to just let this cool the room temperature, I'm going to put it in a baggie, or I'm just going to turn the oven off and leave it in the oven, and then when the oven drops down to temperature, and I can touch it and it's warm, or it's cool, I know I'm good to go. I should have hit on this before we got this far, but we have a few options when it comes to tanks. So this is the tank I bought probably 15 years ago. This is what they all started out as. It was basically a tank made out of, I don't know, probably 1/2-inch plexiglass. And the lid itself is pretty simple. It's just a wood lid with some craft foam around the inside, and it's got an inlet valve and a pressure gauge. All it does is sit there. It doesn't have to lock on it. It's just, they all just sit, because once you pull the vacuum, it sucks the lid on. You know you're getting a seal. You may have to wipe these seals off a little bit before you use them, or around the edges. But for the most part, they just sit there. They don't lock in. You don't have to worry about weighting them down. But you want them see-through. You want to be able to see into the tank so you know what's going on. The reason for that is, as you start to stabilize this, it's gonna start boiling. It looks like a boil. It's basically, you're pulling all the air out of that wood. Well, it's gotta go somewhere, so now it looks like the resin's boiling. Well, as it gets foamy, it starts to rise. You don't wanna suck resin into your vacuum pump through the hose. You wanna be able to release the pressure and drop that down and wait a little bit and then increase it again. So I'll mess around with the valve. Some guys will say, I'll throw it in there and I'll let it sit for 3 hours and then I'll release it. I release that sucker every 10, 15 minutes when I start out. Back and forth, back and forth. So what it's doing is it's pulling the air out. And the minute you release the pressure, it forces the resin in because that resin is being pulled in where that water or where that air was. So the more resin you get in that wood, the less air is coming out. So as the air stops the boil, and now you've just got bubbles coming out, you're able to set your tank, your valve to where I'll pull a vacuum on it for maybe an hour. I know some guys will say, yeah, let it run all night. I don't trust this pump to run all night without getting too hot. So I never leave it unattended. I'm always in the room with it, and I can see what's going on. I'll let it bubble for, an hour. I'll release it a dozen times in between, and then I'll just turn it off and let it soak for a day or two. The rule of thumb is let your wood soak twice as long as you pull the vacuum. Well, if they're pen blanks or a corn cob, you're done in 20 minutes, right? There's nothing to it. But if it's a bigger piece of wood, it might take you a few hours. So there's nothing wrong with, I let it vacuum for an hour today, and I had to go to work or I had to go do this. Came back tomorrow, did it for another hour or so. You don't have to do it all at one time. The only thing you have to do at one time is cook it. So I've got options here. So now if I'm going to do, say, if I want to make recurve bows and I want a riser, and I need about 18 inches to cut me a nice handle out of before I laminate my limbs, I need something tall. If I'm going to do blocks like this, I can stack them in here. One thing that's nice is, even if it's the biggest tank they make, and these range anywhere from, I want to say $120 up to $300-400, depending on the size, because they just keep getting bigger. There is a couple smaller than this one, but these just keep getting taller. Nothing says you can't take a smaller container and put your pen blanks in it, and now you just pour juice in this container and set it inside. It suits the same purpose, and you're not wasting all that juice filling a tank up to the top just because you have a couple of pen blanks in the bottom. So I always say, if you're going to get into it, buy what you can afford. Always think down the road, are you going to do something larger? Because if you buy the tiniest one they have, you really don't want to have to turn around and reinvest to buy bigger ones. It's easier to buy something larger and just put smaller containers in them.
Is the juice reusable?
The juice is reusable. So anything that doesn't get sucked into the wood, I pour right back in the container, seal it up. As long as there's no color in it, I can use it on any wood. So one thing that you have to do, though, is you need a weight. When I bought this tank, it came with these steel weights on them, which kind of hold it. You can use anything you want. If you've got a mesh bag full of washers or bolts and nuts or a rock, it doesn't matter. You just need your wood to stay under that level of resin. So the juice always has to be deeper than what you have in it. Because if you have air, if this is sticking out of the juice, well, it kind of defeats the purpose to pull a vacuum, because what I'm doing is sucking air in here and it's coming through the wood and bubbling out here. I'm not forcing resin in this part because it's exposed. So it has to be completely submerged. So how I would do this now, I've dried this, yes?
John, does some wood like walnut give up color to the juice?
Oh yeah. Yeah, you'll find some woods will darken or color your resin. And you want to be careful, and if you're going to use something of light, or say you want to stabilize some holly, or maybe a piece of pine that was from a homestead, or something that you want to preserve and turn, you're not going to want to use that dark stained juice for that. So you kind of want to know, I might have to keep a clean gallon set off to the side if I'm going to do something. And by using those smaller containers, it really helps you conserve, because you don't have to pour all of it in there. The nice thing about this stuff, it all comes with great instructions. Of course, you might have to take a picture with your phone and then blow it up to read it, because it's real tiny print. But it's very self-explanatory. Tonight, I'm gonna show you how I would stabilize, but I'm not gonna use real stabilizing resin, only because it smells. It's not as bad as casting resin, but also I have to get that home, and I don't wanna leak it out in Dick's truck or my wife's car when I get to his house. So, how I would do this, though, is I would dry this. So we've dried this now. It took, say, 4 hours to get this to where the weight doesn't change anymore. We're at equal weight. It hasn't changed, so I know all the moisture is out. I'm gonna basically put that in the bottom of my tank, and I'm gonna set a weight on top, and I'm gonna pour my juice. Now, this is water, but I will tell you that cactus juice, water is, I think, like 0.95 or 1 on the viscosity chart. Cactus juice is 30 or 40. So there's not a lot of difference between them. It just, to give you an idea, I print a few out here. Corn syrup is 5,000, honey is 10,000, motor oil is 500. So when you're looking between 1 and 30, there really isn't that big of a difference. So what we're gonna do is, we've poured it in, we've got that completely submerged. Put a little more in it because it's gonna soak in.
John, you usually wear gloves?
Yes. So I like nitrile gloves, and I always wear safety glasses as well. Because I'm dealing with water, I'm not gonna bother with it because I'm just gonna knock the stuff off. But nitrile is your better glove. Use these over latex. Latex will always distort, the fingers will swell up, then they'll tear off. Nitrile is more of a medical grade, and it just holds up better to wear and tear. If you get it on you, just soap and water, wash it off real well. You don't want to pour this stuff down a drain, anything like that. You know, it's reusable, so pour it back in the bottle containers and store them in the basement if you have one. So what I would do is, first off, can everybody get a look at that? See that okay? Well, I guess I got a camera right there. We'll be able to look at it. So your pumps are probably the heaviest. They must sell these by the pound because this pump costs about $400. It's a larger pump. You can get them a lot cheaper. You can get the smaller ones for a couple hundred. Basically, the main thing is you want to be able to see into your tank, so that way you're not sucking cactus juice through this tube, through the vacuum, into your pump. You don't want to mess your pumps up. So
Let's see if
what did we say, it was 6? I didn't even read on it.
It says 6.
6? Okay, yep. You don't have to have one this big. Apparently that day, I had more money than brains because I bought the big one. My wife didn't say no, so that's her fault. But the nice thing is, though, you can get a quick vacuum on it. You can hold that pressure on it really well. They're not real loud. I do all this in my basement. And before I bought that smoker, and I'll get to how I do it, but I would use just a regular old kitchen oven. Now, you don't want to use an oven that you're going to eat food in because you don't want that vapor sticking to all the sides of the oven or the racks, and then, you know, you have to worry about that getting on your food. But that's our vacuum. And now I'm going to turn this on. And as I turn it on, you can see it bubbling. So it kind of looks like it's boiling. And what we're doing is we're literally sucking the air out of this wood. Now, if this were deeper, and I've had it to where it was up to maybe an inch over, below the top, I'd have to be worried about that bubbling up. Water doesn't seem to stay as frothy as real cactus juice does. But basically what's going to happen is you're going to see all these air bubbles coming out. Now as I do that, I'm going to release the pump a couple times. And you see it stops because the resin now goes into the wood. So if I were going to do this whole piece, I would just let this run for half hour to an hour, depending on the bubbles. Now because this is extremely dry box elder burl, this will have as much exhaust. I spilled a little oil. It was on its side, so I know it's going to smoke a hair. But Because this is box elder burl and it's real dry, the water's gonna soak in real quick. The cactus juice would soak in almost as fast, so you wouldn't have to run a vacuum on this that long. I would still let this soak at least overnight. So by letting it soak overnight, basically what it's gonna do is make sure it fills all those wood pores, so when you cook this, you don't have any dry area inside that wood. So after I've let it soak in, those larger pieces I pass around, I let them soak for, I think 3 or 4 days. What I like to do is I'll fill this. I haven't used these two yet because they're just, this was already dirty. And I have to change the fittings to fit this pump, so I haven't done it yet. But I filled this, pulled the vacuum on it, I let it run until everything was good. I let it soak overnight. And then what I did is I dumped all this in an old ice cream bucket and I just topped it up with juice. So it's always good to have a couple gallons on hand when you do it, because the drier the wood, the more juice it's gonna soak up. So I just set that aside and I pulled a vacuum on another tank full. And in the picture then you can see, I think I had 3 racks full of wood on the shelf that I stabilized all at one time. Because it's such a long process, I don't like to do 1 or 2 little pieces, right? I'm gonna do as much as I can fit into the tank or into the bowl or the oven. So after we've done with that, basically we just pull everything out, wipe it off, and it's not like the water, which would continuously drip out. Because this juice is a little thicker, it actually stays in the wood pores really nicely. Once you wipe it off, you don't have a lot of excess falling out. But what I like to do is I pick up some of these foil baking pans. Now, in the beginning, everybody said, in fact, the guy that introduced cactus juice to the world, Curtis Seebeck from Turntex, he said, well, make sure you wrap it in foil. Wrap it all up real nice in foil and then throw that in the oven and cook it. That way you're keeping everything inside, it's not leaking out. Here's the problem, when you go to open that foil, you've got this big ball of crust because you didn't give that excess resin anywhere to go. So what I like to do is I'll take some bamboo skewers and I'll lay them in the bottom of the pan, and then I'll just take these blocks of wood as I get them, and I'll just set them across there. That way it's not sitting on the bottom of the pan, so I'm not gonna essentially glue it to the foil. It's just gonna give that extra resin as it comes out somewhere to go. I don't want it piled on top of each other. I like to let everything kind of set where it is because I don't want to stick it to each other as well. And then as I get these pans full, they're gonna go in that smoker rack out on the patio, and I'm gonna cook them. Now there's other ways around that. What I used to do, I'd take metal cake pans, and same thing, bamboo skewers in the bottom. I would layer my wood in there, and I'd always buy 2 of them, so that way I knew that they matched up. So now I've got a top, I've got a lid, and a bottom, and then I buy this tape. It's that HVAC tape. It's the foil with the adhesive on the back. And you can cut it, you can tear it, whatever. But the nice thing is, it's a metal tape, so I would go around all the edges, line these up real well, and I would tape all of this together. And I'd make sure that everything overlapped about 1 inch, and literally go all the way around it. So now it's all self-contained, so I was able to put that in the oven and warm it up. I wouldn't smell anything. The only thing I would smell is the one day I actually touched the outside, and so I got a little bit of residue on my fingers, and the minute I smelled it, pulled it out, I scrubbed it down real good, but I set that in the wife's oven while she was at work, and I don't advocate or teach that, but it worked just fine until she found out. It worked just fine, and she wasn't happy because it was her oven, but I said, you should have been here using it then, right? So, no, I didn't say that. I wouldn't be here tonight if I said that, right? So other options you have. What's that? Yes. And that's why now I have the smoker as well, because I can't do it in the house. But another nice thing is you can get these little cookie drying racks. If your pan is bigger, you can set them in there. And that way what it does is it holds everything off the bottom, so it gives it somewhere to go. Ed Brown told me he uses chicken wire. He takes chicken wire, folds it in half so it's got a little spring to it, and he'll set that in there. And that way it just gives it that gap. You wouldn't even have to set it in the pan, but I just feel better about moving it in and out without it falling. You can set it over the top, but basically, after the wood comes out of the oven and it's undetermined, you have to keep an eye on your temperature gauge, make sure that it's not getting too hot. Once you can keep it around that 225 range, pull it out, let it dry. I let it sit for a few hours. It will take an extra day for it to really harden up. It says it'll continue to harden for about 24 hours. I'm not going to cast with it, and probably for a couple of days anyhow. But take it to the belt sander, sand it off nice and smooth, and it's good to go. A lot of guys will do the double dyed stuff, where they'll add 2 different colors, and what a lot of them are doing, either eyedroppers or jars. I wouldn't advocate putting cactus juice in glass jars. That's been known to solidify in the glass jars because it kind of holds all that heat in there, especially if the sunlight's hitting it. But if you've got a container and you want to fill it, say, half full of green and stand a maple pen blank up in there and let it stand for, I don't know, a couple days, and now you've got one with blue, flip it around and put it the other way. Now you've got it coming in from both directions. You can cook them. Other options are they'll take the dry stuff and just put an eyedropper to it, and they'll add dark color to certain areas. And then after that sits for a day or so, they'll put it in another color, and they'll just pull a vacuum on it, so that way you've got now colors blended throughout the blank. It's just experimentation, whatever you're looking for. I do want to mention that prior to coming here, I spoke to Dawn at Exotic Blanks, and she said for the club, they will offer a 1 week, a code for 1 week under the stabilizing category for 10% off any stabilizing product. So if anybody's interested, she wanted to make it something I wouldn't forget, so she called it John. She doesn't know me very well. All caps, if you want. Now, she also said, because we go up there, and we're going to be up there next Thursday, if anyone wants to save on shipping, just put it in the comments. Please send back with John. I'll make sure to get it to Mark's house. He can get it to you guys, and you can save the shipping on it as well. So if you do buy something, just put it in the comments. Have John pick it up. If they charge you shipping, she said she will refund that once they read it and see the order, so don't be too concerned about that. I've also printed out, I've got 30 copies, so anyone that's serious, if we run out and somebody really wants it, let me know. I can email it to you as well, or you can take pictures of it with your phone. But basically, I just wrote a quick outline on how I dry the wood, and on the back is a 2-page on the actual instructions that come with these tanks on how to stabilize wood. It's pretty simple. There's not a lot to it. The biggest chore is just having the time to do it. So, any other questions? Yes?
I was just gonna ask, do you have like a favorite, like you mentioned Buckeye before, and you showed some big leaf maple burl and stuff, do you have a personal favorite?
I don't like this. I love the look of Buckeye Burl. I hate to stabilize it because I use a whole gallon on a little piece. I really like box elder burl. I like the maple. But I'll be honest, if it's a hardwood, why stabilize it? As you evolve as turners, and most of you guys in this room have turned a lot more than I have. You know your tool control. You know how they cut. You know how to handle them. So if you're hitting resin and then you're moving to wood, if it's a hard maple, just not to be that aggressive, right? If you're too aggressive, it's not going to be round. It's going to be a little out of round because you're going to cut through the wood quicker than you do the resin. So, anything? Yes?
John, there are other places that sell stabilized wood. Do you have any tips on buying other products, kind of like horror stories or things to be careful about when you're buying stabilized woods that somebody else has stabilized?
If it's a commercial stabilizer, I don't think you can go wrong. The home stuff, I've had mixed results. When I first started, if I didn't soak it long enough and I cooked it, I didn't feel like it was as heavy as it should have been. And that's why now I'll soak them. I'll let them just sit in this thing and soak for 3 days before I cook them. If you get into a hurry, you're going to stabilize the outside, but the inside's not going to have the density that you want. So anything commercialized, those guys are great. And it comes back like a rock. I mean, it's good stuff. As far as people like me doing it in their garage or their basement, it's just all on reputation. If you're gonna buy something from them, start small and try it and see what you think. So, anything else?
On the tools, how hard is it on the tools once you stabilize the water?
Like, it isn't as hard as resin. No, I mean, you may not get the ribbons you used to get, but you're gonna cut, it's not gonna be just shavings or it's not gonna be a sawdust or, a scrape. You can still cut it. So, and again, that just comes down to your personal preference, how fast you turn, how sharp your tools are, your style or technique and experience. So, anything else?
Did you say you could color cactus juice?
You can, yes. So, real quick, there's two things that they recommend. There's the Alumilite dyes, or there's actual stabilizing dye, and they both work well. The problem is the stabilizing dyes are more concentrated than the casting dye. So the Alumilite trans tints, you'll use a lot more of it to get the color that you would out of the stabilizing dye. Anything else? Yes? No. No, I know there's so many different things on the market, and I assume those big companies that are stabilizing stuff and have been for a year, they're using far better products than what we have at our hands. Accessible. They're using stuff I'm sure that's probably under a lot more pressure or vacuum, and that stable or dries a little harder or smoother. I spoke to Jason Morosi at Best Value Vac, and they're the ones that make this kind of stuff, and they actually have their own stabilizing solution. And from what he wouldn't come completely forward with all of it, but from what he shed the light on, all of this stabilizing liquid basically comes from the same company, and then and I believe that's in the UK, because they have to put it in order at the beginning of the year as to how much they think they're going to need throughout the year, and then they get these drums, and then they fine-tune it when they get it in the States to do, because this stuff is used in automotive work and other things. It's not just, for us wood turners. So they've just evolved it along the way to fit our needs. So, I want to say it's around $90 a gallon. And again, it all depends on, if you're using Buckeye, it's going to get expensive, unfortunately. And the tanks, like I said, they range. This tank is $195. I think this tank was about $140 or $150. Because these plastic tubes, they just, the longer they are, the more they get you. You're buying them so much by the foot or the inch. And because of the rest of it, there's really not much,
How many years ago, John, was those prices?
Last year. So I don't believe they've changed any in these tanks. The only thing that's really gone up is the shipping to get them. So. They are. Those guys, so BVV is really, they've got their hands in all sorts of stuff. Now they're doing all of the cannabis plants for the aerations and all the liquid stuff. They're way out here, it's not just stabilizing anymore. I think stabilizing is just the fun. I'll be honest with you, the cheapest price you'll ever find on this stuff is when you go to the MPG.
A year ago, I bought a set of stuff from them, and I actually picked it up in Naperville.
Yeah,
And
oh yeah.
they're so gracious, they even give you a tour of the whole operation, which is amazing.
They're great people to talk to and deal with. Yeah, I can't say enough nice about Jason Morosi. He's come to the MPG for the last, 4 years, and he just loves to sit and talk. They'll show you the product. They come out with some crazy stuff. Them small little stabilizers that they're putting under a couple 100 pounds of pressure, which is insane, but it literally stabilizes in 20 minutes. But it's a hand grenade and a little steel screw-on thread caps. And I'll do some crazy stuff, but I don't know about that one. So, anything else? Awesome. Well, I appreciate you guys listening. I put these handouts on the corner of the table here, so if anybody wants the information, feel free to take it.